Air India acquisition by the Tatas. A lot has been talked about this, a lot has been written about this. This is pretty much an old news now. This video, this lecture is not going to be about the acquisition per se. I'm going to talk about some of the details about it. Of course, I'm going to do that. But the larger intention of this video is to talk about this acquisition and to illustrate how far have we as a political economy, India's political economy, have come, the journey that the Indian political economy has traversed ever since the independence till the present day. This lecture is about that. How far have we come and what is the way forward? This is what we are going to discuss in this particular lecture. Now, the Air India acquisition, this is in a way a homecoming for the Tatas, right? Tatas brought Air India for 18,000 crore rupees. Incidentally, Air India was started by the Tatas in the year 1932. That was when GRD Tata started this particular airlines, and that time the name was Tata Airlines. It was not Air India. Then in 1932, when GRD Tata started this airlines, the name was Tata Airlines. After World War II, on 29th July 1946, Tata Airlines was listed as a public limited company, and that time, after 2 years of the listing, actually in 1948, the name was changed from Tata Airlines to Air India Limited. In fact, it was during that time in 1948 that the government of India took 49% stake in Air India. That was government's first entry into the Air India business. The government took a 49% stake in Air India. Now, in the year 1953, that was the year when the government of India completely took over the airlines. In fact, in 1953, the government of India passed a law which nationalized all the 9 running airlines of that time, and they completely took them over. It was not a acquisition. It was not that the Tatas or the other airlines sold their airlines to the government. No, the law was passed, and all of a sudden all the airlines came under government's control. The government is going to control all the airlines at that time. Okay. Now, this was the scenario. It's after 68 years that the Indian Air India, the airlines that the Tatas had started, it's coming back to the Tatas again. It's like a homecoming for them. Now, if you look at the market share, the present day market share of the different airlines that's running in the Indian aviation sector, you will find that Indigo is the market leader, and Indigo right now has around 57.6% market share. 57.6% market share for Indigo. Next comes Air India, and Air India has 13.3% market share. Then you have SpiceJet, which has 8.9%. Then you have Vistara, which has 8.2%. Go First, which has 6.8%, and finally you have Air Asia, which has 4.4%. Now, out of all of these airlines, if you see, there are 2 airlines, Vistara and Air Asia. Vistara has 8.2% and Air Asia has 4.4% market share. These 2 airlines are actually controlled and owned by the Tatas. In Vistara, which has a market share of 8.2%, Tatas have a stake of 51%. So essentially, Tatas are the controlling partner in Vistara. In Air Asia, Tatas had 84% share in Air Asia. So Tatas essentially control the entire Air Asia, control Air Asia. So Vistara, Air Asia, and now with the addition of Air India, essentially right now at present day, Tatas are having 25% market share in the aviation space in India. 25%, around 25%. So this is the present scenario right now. Every day government was incurring a cost of around 20 to 25 crores in running Air India. It was taxpayer money. The reason why majorly around the country this news was greeted, was cheered, was because government no longer would have to invest, or rather have to waste taxpayers' money to run this airline. Now a private entity is going to run this airline, and a private company of the stature of the TATAs, which have an impeccable record, is hugely respected in the country. They are going to run this airline, and hopefully they will be able to turn it around. Now we'll have to wait for this. There is a lot of time that has to pass on before we can really judge whether Tatas are able to turn around Air India or not. There's something that we'll have to see in the future. Today in this particular lecture, I will be talking about the India's political economy. So what does this deal tell us? Government has not just divested some part of its stake to a private entity. Government has completely divested 100% of the shares to Tatas. Couple of years back, the government did try to privatize Air India, but it was not a successful initiative. Why? Because at that time, government was trying to divest only a portion of Air India stake, and no private entity wanted to get into an agreement with the government where the government has some stake, because you never know which government changes, who are the bureaucrats, and in making any major decision they would have to take government's nod. No one really wants to get into such a kind of collaboration with the government. So this time the difference was, government said we are going to completely sell Air India. We are going to give out 100% stake of Air India to any private company who can buy it. And that's the reason why this time it was a successful initiative. The acquisition was successful. So the question is, what does this tell us about India's political economy? For that, let me take you back to the 1950s. Traditionally, India has been a socialist economy. India has followed the tenets of socialism until 1991, and I'll tell you what happened in 1991. And by socialism, what do you mean by socialism? By socialism, we mean an economy where the state controls almost everything, and citizens have to depend on the state for their survival, for their employment, and everything. The factors of production, that is land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, are controlled by the state. Now this, mind you, the word socialist was not part of the Indian constitution when it was first drafted. This word socialist was added in the year 1976 during the emergency as part of the 42nd Amendment of 1976. The word socialist was added to the preamble of the constitution. So this word came much later. However, it was the 1950s when the Indian state, the Indian government actually started walking on the path of socialism. In the year 1948, that was the year, that was the starting point. In the year 1948, the Industrial Policy Resolution was passed, and this proposed that India is going to adopt a mixed economy. What do you understand by mixed economy? Mixed economy essentially means where a country is going to adopt the best of both worlds, the best of socialism and the best of capitalism. So India is a mixed economy. Even today, India is a mixed economy. But in the 1950s, the difference was, though we called ourselves a mixed economy, the inclinations were more towards socialism and less towards capitalism. Over a period, what happened was that we started taking the worst of both, worst of capitalism and worst of socialism. Rather than taking the best, we started taking the worst of both worlds. And I'll talk more about this. So in 1948, we proposed that India is going to adopt a mixed economy. And then the planning commission was set up. The planning commission, is no longer exists. The Niti Aayog has been constituted in place of the Planning Commission. But India set up the Planning Commission in 1950. And why was the Planning Commission set up? The Planning Commission was set up to oversee planning, resource allocation, implementation, and more importantly, to prepare 5-year plans. Okay, so what is the country going to adopt, or rather achieve, in the next 5 years? So this was a system. The 5-year plan was a system which is adopted from the Soviet Union, USSR, which is a model of socialism. And that time the Indian leadership, the government of India, was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union model, the USSR model, and they took that 5-year model in our country as well. So the first 5-year plan was launched in the year 1951, and in the first 5-year plan, the focus was more on agriculture, irrigation, in order to boost farm output. So India was losing out a lot of foreign reserves in importing food grains. So India was importing a lot of food grains because in our country we were not producing enough food grains for the entire population. So we had to import a lot of it, and for that our forex reserves were depleting. We wanted to ensure that our country sufficiently produces enough food grains so that we decrease our dependency on imports. So the first 5-year plan in 1951 focused on that let's focus more on agriculture, let's focus more on irrigation. Now this 5-year plan was based on a Harrod-Domer model. It's a pretty famous model. I'm not going to get deep into it right now. Maybe in one of the lectures I'll talk about it. Now this model essentially talked of higher savings and investment. The plan initially was a success. India witnessed an annualized growth rate of 3.6%, which did beat the estimate of 2.1% at that time. Now, 3.6% at that time was considered a very high economic growth. No one even talked of double-digit growth. But if you look at it, given the size of India at that time, given the enormous potential that the country had, given that India was a pretty young country in that sense because it had just got independence, and there was so much population who had to be brought out of poverty, who had to be brought out of unemployment, India should have grown in double digits. But given we were focusing more on agriculture, we were adopting a socialist economic model, our growth rates could not be realistically on the higher side. Now, the second 5-year plan was instituted in 1956. And this is the real economic or rather the 5-year plan which actually set our economic ideology in place. Okay, India's focus towards adopting socialist measures or a socialist economy in the garb of a mixed economy. This started in 1956 with the second 5-year plan. And one of the masterminds who really made this 5-year plan was P.C. Mahalanobis. You might have heard about Mahalanobis model. P.C. Mahalanobis is considered to be the father of modern statistics in India. He is also the founder of the prestigious Indian Statistical Institute, ISI. Now, his ideas were put into the second 5-year plan. And what did the second 5-year plan talk of? The second 5-year plan talked of rapid industrialization with a focus on heavy industries and capital goods. So the second 5-year plan talked of heavy industrialization. Now you might ask, what's bad in that? If there are more industries, there will be more employment and many more people would be getting employment, they will be earning. Overall, the country's growth rate would increase. So what's bad in that? The problem was, how is the government or how would the country focus on rapid industrialization? Because the government at that time did not have enough resources to invest on rapid industrialization. So what this model suggests, or what the second 5-year plan suggested, was that India will borrow more, right? In a way, India was gearing up for heavy deficit where they will be borrowing money and they would be investing on heavy industrialization. Now what happens because of this? When you have a very high deficit, obviously your economic health is not well. You are leveraging, you are incurring huge debt. Now Now, even the industrialization that is being talked about, it was not a free market. Even those sectors in where the industrialization would happen, those were regulated markets under the government of India, and the license raj, people had to take licenses in order to open a new industry, open a new business, open a new company. Now, I just talked about the worst of both worlds, worst of socialism and worst of capitalism. This is one of the primary instances. You're talking of industrialization, good, but how we are going to do that? You are going to borrow more money. You are going to incur more deficit, and that's fine. You're incurring that, but then what are you going to do? You're also going to regulate all of the industries, all of the sectors. That means anyone cannot just come in and open their company. You are not going to reward efficient businesses. Companies or business people had to take permissions, licenses from bureaucrats, from politicians. Lot of corruption resulted as a consequence of such a policy. Okay, obviously inflation also went up. Okay, now this second 5-year plan, it essentially started that ideological shift towards socialism, as I just mentioned. Now, what the second 5-year plan also did was it categorized industries into three groups. The first group was industries under the basic and strategic importance, and those industries were kept exclusively for the public sector, that is under the government's control. Something like defense, railways, those were considered to be the industries of basic and strategic importance, and those were kept under public sector, that is completely under government's control, and even the companies that were running were completely owned by the government. The second group was that of incrementally state-owned. So there would be some other sectors where the government would have their own participation through different companies, and also the private sector would be allowed to participate in a very limited manner. So that was the second group. The third group was left completely for the private sector, and those were usually the consumer industries. But even in those industries, there was license raj, where anyone just could not open up a company. They had to take licenses, they had to take a lot of permissions, and as I said, all of this resulted in pleasing the babus, in pleasing the politicians, the bureaucrats, and as a result, a lot of corruption prevailed. So essentially, there are three groups. One considered as a sector of strategic importance, which was kept completely solely for the public sector, that is for the government control. Second, where the government allowed limited private private sector participation, and then the third sector, which is given to the private sector completely, and those were again the consumer durables, the consumer industries. But again, even in those sectors, there were license raj. Then the war with China happened, and when the war with China happened, what happened because of this was there was chronic food shortages, and prices started going up. There was heavy inflation, and that was the time when India realized that we need to give up centralized planning and price control. The second Prime Minister of India, Lal Bahadur Shastri, he brought in a renewed focus on agriculture. He accepted a larger role of the private enterprises. He said that private enterprises, you come in and you participate in nation building, because we, the government, cannot do it alone. Okay, and he also, very importantly, trimmed down the role of the planning commission. Okay, but again, that was a very short-lived thing. In the 1960s, India was on the verge of mass famine, and as a result, that time the Green Revolution came in under the aegis of M.S. Swaminathan, who brought in the Green Revolution, and that somehow saved India, okay, from acute food shortages. But again, as I said, that was a very short-lived thing, allowing private sector, higher participation of the private sector, giving up control, centralized control. All of those was a pretty short-lived thing. Comes the year 1969, and this is one episode, the year 1969, where that complete focus towards socialism really started. I mean, all of this while it was more of mixed economy sort of thing, where we are trying to do both socialism, capitalism, and all of this. But 1969, it really happened right in front on a massive scale, and the government in fact started saying that we are a socialist government. In 1969, on 20th July, the government of India privatized 14 private banks. Nationalization of 14 private banks, and that time the Prime Minister of the country was Mrs. Indira Gandhi. The main aim of this move was to accelerate bank lending to agriculture at a time when big businesses concerned cornered large chunks of the credit flow. So at that time what used to happen was, since those are private sector banks, they obviously thought of profits. Okay, and since they thought of profits, they did not lend to anyone and everyone. If you come to ask money from the bank, you had to show some credit scores. The banks had to be convinced that you are in a position to pay back the money. Now, private sector, obviously, if they had to survive, they had to think of all those consequences. Now, the moment those banks became public sector, the moment those banks came under the aegis of the government was to think of the welfare of the nation, right? So those banks now started lending to anyone and everyone who is to come. The poorest of the poor, the richest of the rich, they started lending to everyone without even thinking whether those people will be able to pay them back or not. NPAs started booming up. Today, many of the problems of NPA that you're talking about, many of those started because of that. Because when you had public sector banks, what used to happen is that those are under the control of the ministers. Those are under the control of the politicians. So any big business who wanted to take more loans, even though they may not be eligible in a fair process to lend more, and those companies are already in debt. In such situations, those businesses used to approach the ministers, they used to approach the politicians, and by giving some bribe, giving some money, they were able to secure loans from those banks, right? For example, if I am a company and my financial health is not that great, yet I want more money from the banks, right? So what I would do is that I would approach a minister or a politician who have some say with the management of the bank, and I would pay some bribe to that minister or the politician, and they would in turn talk to the banks, and the bank would lend me money, right? That was in a way called crony capitalism. And then you had the marginalized section who used to get credits at the initially to start with, but then most of them were unable to pay back, and as a result the financial health of the banks started going down, right? Also, the banks did not have any competition because they were under the control of the government. If anything happens, the government would bail them out, and there was no real competition. So all of these banks did not become efficient over time. Rather, the culture of the banks that you see became more lackluster. They did not really think of serving their customers, and it was a more of the sarkari setup. Ki abhi lunch ka time hai, right now it's time for lunch. Come after an hour, come after 2 hours, today no more, come tomorrow. Those sort of things started booming up. Okay, that was 1969, and ever since then India has been going through a socialist setup, right? The state, the government controlling all the sectors, heavily regulated, and very minimal private sector participation. Now comes the year 1991. So what happened in 1991? India was at one of its worst economic crisis in 1991. And how bad was the crisis? India was on the brink of sovereign default. Gulf War had led to a very sharp rise in the prices. That's one. Prices of oil. Okay, the Gulf War had led to a sharp rise in the oil prices. That's one. Second, there was a fall in remittances from the Indian workers who were working abroad. Second. Third, there was a sharp decline in India's forex reserves. In fact, the forex reserves of India in 1991 was less than $6 billion, and this was just enough to meet the country's imports for just about 2 weeks. That's how bad it was for India. For the very first time, the country had to sell around 20 tons of gold to investment bank UBS in order to secure $240 million of loan. That was the first time India had to do that to secure a loan. The country also pledged gold 3 times more after that sell, shipping around 46.8 million tons of the yellow metal to secure $400 million in loan. Right? Just to secure $400 million in loan, India had to ship 46.8 million tons of gold. Okay, and whom did they take the loan from? They took the loan from the Bank of England and Bank of Japan. Right now, that was the condition that India was in 1991, and that's the time when this famous budget led by Dr. Narasimha Rao under the leadership of PV Narasimha Rao, who ushered in through that budget, the 1991 budget, who ushered in the era of liberalization, who ushered in the era of privatization, of opening up the Indian economy. That was a time when the leadership of India realized that India can no longer follow the same socialist paths. India needs to open up. India needs to allow foreign players to come in the country. India needs to allow more participation, more private sector participation. It has to be a level playing field for all companies, and only then the country would grow. Only then the country's problems, the economic condition of the country would improve. And then the 1991 budget came. Of course, it met with huge protests. Of course, that was there, but it was great for the country in the long run. And in 1991, we gradually started making a shift from socialism to capitalism. Remember, we are a mixed economy, which we are, and that's how it should be. But initially, before 1991, through the bank nationalization, through the acquisition of Air India in 1953, and many other steps, the focus, the shift, the orientation was more towards socialism. Post 1991, the orientation started shifting more towards capitalism. There are still elements of socialism, and this will always be there, but the orientation is more towards capitalism now. In the Union Budget of 1999-2000, the then Finance Minister, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, he took forward an idea that he had seeded that was seeded in 1991 budget. That is disinvestment in public sector enterprises and downsizing the stake of the government. Right? That was in 1999-2000. The thing that you see of the Air India acquisition, that journey started around 1999-2000. Obviously, the government at that time could not just completely sell off any company. They had to divest. In fact, the term privatization was not used in those times. It's very recently only when the word privatization is being used by government officials, by government ministers. The term that was traditionally being used by India was disinvestment, saying that no, we are not privatizing, we are not selling it off completely. We are only divesting some stake in order to generate some money that we need for nation building. So the term was disinvestment. After this, throughout that period of 1999-2000 till to the present day, there have been a slew of measures by all the governments who have come in to divest their stakes in different PSUs, in different government-run businesses. And this period also saw, which in a way enabled actually, that big Indian businesses now started gaining or started owning other companies abroad. And I'll give you a few examples. The Aditya Birla Group's Hindalco Industries, right? They did a $6 billion buyout of US-based Novelis in 2007. So an Indian company buying a foreign company. Then the next year, that is in 2008, you have Tata Motors. They bought JLR. It is a very famous acquisition, Jaguar Land Rover, for $2.3 billion. Right? And then in 2010, Bharti Airtel brought out Zen Africa for $10.7 billion. It was an era of multi-billion dollar acquisitions. Indian companies were going out and they were buying companies abroad. Right? Now, over the past decade, if you see, the Indian startup ecosystem has really gone to the next level. If those were the initial days when Bharti Airtel had acquired Zen, when Hindalco had acquired Novelis, when Tata had acquired JLR, those were the initial days. Ever since from 2010 onwards, many startups started coming in India. Many startups started blooming in India with government policies, ease of doing business, more investors coming in the market. You see a lot of unicorns in the Indian startup ecosystem right now. Just in the last 10 months, not far, just in the last 10 months, India had 34 unicorns. The startups raised around $26 billion plus in around 1100 plus deals. So in 1100 plus deals, $26 billion were raised by Indian startups, by Indian companies based out of India, the Indian startups. And mind you, these are the times of the pandemic. This happened just in the last 10 months. And you will see a lot more startups, lot more unicorns. And by unicorns, we mean a company which has a valuation of more than $1 billion. You will see a lot more startups coming up in India, and a lot more startups going abroad, venturing out, and Indian companies operating in different geographies. You'll see this as a more common phenomenon going ahead. Okay, this is a shift that we see in the Indian political economy, from a socialist orientation to a more capitalist orientation. Because when you have a capitalist orientation, you have more private sector participation, and when you have more private sector participation, there's more job creation, there's more competition. It's good for all the stakeholders involved. Right? This is the shift that our political economy is seeing. It can be any government now. This policy is going to run in continuation. If India really has to achieve that goal of a $5 trillion economy, of elevating a more number of people out of poverty, if you want to really compete with the advanced economies of the country, this is the way to go. We have to orient ourselves more towards capitalism rather than socialism. I'm not suggesting that government role should not be there. Government's role, of course, have to be there. In strategic sectors, government role has to be there in order to ensure that there's no single company which is undertaking unfair means in any of the sectors. Government has to ensure that proper policies, proper rules, proper frameworks are put in place, proper anti-competitive institutions are put in place, just to ensure that everyone has a level playing field. There's no crony capitalism. The policies are fair. The law treats everyone equally. There's law enforcement that happens. All of this is part of the work that government needs to do. But once they do that, how to run a business, how to drive an entire sector, how do companies add value for customers, the pricing that happens, everything should be given up to the market forces, and that's when real growth will happen. This Air India acquisition by the Tatas is a milestone. I'm saying this word because it is marking a significant chapter in India's political economy. We are no longer using the term divestment. We are talking of privatization. We are not just thinking of divesting or selling off some percentage of the stake. We are now talking of selling a completely government-owned company completely into the private sector, right? 100% sell off, right? We are talking of those terms, and going forward, you'll see more and more companies being completely sold off, or at least majority of the stake being sold off by the government and to the private sector, right? This is the way forward, and if this is something that we can live up to, if this is something we can continue doing it, I see no reason that India as a country would not prosper going ahead. Thank you so much for watching.